only. So we're here for the first panel of our 47th annual Jack Williams Lectureship. I want to thank you all for coming here at 8:30 in the morning. This is the same panel slot we had the first academic panel we did, which was last year, and it was, fairly well attended, especially for an 8:30 a.m. panel. So thank you all for coming. We also have a decent turnout for 8:30 a.m. here. So, we're also streaming online, so thank you to you who streamed online here. So, we're going to go in the order that they are presented in the program, which means that first up we'll have Sara Spurgeon, then we'll have Micah Donohue, then we'll have Myrriah Gómez. As always for academic panels here, or as is usually the pattern, we will hold questions for after the panelists have all given their papers, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So I will give the bio for each presenter. So first up we have Sara Spurgeon. Sara Spurgeon is a professor of literatures of the American Southwest at Texas Tech University, where she founded and directs the Literature, Social Justice, and Environment program, and co-chairs the Interdisciplinary Graduate Certificate in Indigenous and Native American Studies. She's published on Native American speculative fiction, the Aboriginal television series Cloverman, and her forthcoming poetic collection, Help It for Leather, Sex and Sexuality in the Weird West End, is due in late 2024. Thank you, Sara.
So I'm going to be talking today about a novel that you've probably never heard of, The Indians Won, by an author you might have heard of, Martin Cruz Smith. So his name might be familiar to you, but probably not as a Native American writer, and probably not as a writer of speculative fiction. He's most well known as the author of the international thriller Gorky Park, published in 1981, and then given an Oscar-nominated film adaptation starring William Hurt a few years later. And then there was a string of Arcady Branco detective novels that followed Gorky Park. He's typically spoken of as a writer of intellectual literary thrillers whose ethnicity is generally unmarked in reviews. He's rarely acknowledged as a Native American author, except when his handful of relatively unknown Indian novels are reviewed. So a little background on Smith might be useful. He was born in 1942. His father was John Calhoun, a white jazz musician. His mother was Louise Cruz Smith, part Yaqui, part Islera del Sur Pueblo, and Nuevo Mexicano. She was an Indian rights activist and a jazz singer. So although, I'm not surprised to hear, his parents hoped he would go into music, Smith instead chose to study creative writing and journalism. And he worked as a journalist both in the US and in Europe in the 1960s before returning to the United States. In 1967, he moved to New York and worked for a company called Magazine Management, a company you've never heard of. He edited and nearly single-handedly wrote under a number of pseudonyms. Magazine Management's men's magazine, for men only. Magazine Management is actually remembered today for fostering a number of exceptional young writers in the 1960s, including Mario Puzo, who would go on to write The Godfather. But Smith was fired in 1969 when he refused to introduce sexualized content that he described as, quote, pretty unpleasant stuff about roughing up women. That is when he began writing his first novel, The Indians Won. It would be published in 1970. So The Indians Won is set up as a pseudo-documentary of an alternate history, imagining what might have occurred if the coalition of Western tribes that defeated Custer had been able to gain access to weapons afterwards. Unsurprisingly, the US government had made it illegal to sell guns to Native Americans while it was genociding them and stealing their land. With access to weapons, Smith speculates, a well-armed Native coalition would successfully fend off further white settlement in the Great Plains. And by the end of the 19th century, in the novel, he imagines them establishing an Indian nation covering the entire Great Plains, stretching from Canada to Mexico, and basically bifurcating the United States into an eastern and a western half. So while Smith clearly has fun with this novel, imagining in great detail what brilliant military strategists like Crazy Horse and Geronimo could have done with howitzers, the book is quite serious in its exploration of how nation building occurs and what a truly sovereign Indian nation might look like. So Smith, who was still working as a journalist while he was writing The Indians One, covered many of the massive social upheavals taking place around the world in the late 1960s, especially 1969. And he's interested in the colonialist roots of many of these conflicts, and those shape this novel. So in 1969, the peace talks in Paris attempting to resolve the Vietnam War were expanded to include the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese government. A federal grand jury in the United States indicted the anti-war protesters known as the Chicago Eight for conspiring to incite a riot at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. President Richard Nixon announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, even as he intensified the bombing of Cambodia. The House of Representatives and the U.S. Army concluded their investigation of the 1968 My Lai massacre, in which U.S. troops shot an estimated 400 to 500 Vietnamese civilians, finding only Second Lieutenant William Calley guilty of premeditated murder. And massive anti-war demonstrations across the United States, which Smith covered as a journalist, shut down many college and university campuses, prompting then Governor Ronald Reagan to order California National Guard helicopters to spray tear gas on student demonstrators. So 1969, though, was also a year of intense organizing and activism by Native Americans. It witnessed the rise of AIM, the American Indian Movement, which sought, among other goals, to challenge U.S. federal policies that treated Native people as though they were enemy aliens in their own lands. AIM overtly connected settler colonialism and white supremacy with the war in Vietnam, and many AIM members and leaders, including Carter Camp and Stan Holder, were veterans of that conflict, just as Smith imagines Indian Civil War veterans stepping into military and organizational leadership roles in the Indian Wars of the 1870s that result in his novel in the establishment of the Indian nation. So the Indians One is closely concerned with mapping colonization and forms of native resistance, both factual and imagined, within its speculative historic framework. So interestingly, the novel actually opens outside of Paris in 1875, where we see 5 men from various European nations who are meeting to discuss empire and global investment. Quote, they did not represent their countries so much as they represented countries within countries. That is, the sources of power behind a nation's power. Smith's narrator explains that during the US Civil War, these men had helped the Confederacy gain international recognition as a belligerent, thus creating an instant market for munitions and supplies paid for by suddenly legitimate Confederate bonds. This last part is real world history. Both France and Great Britain recognized the Confederacy. But beyond the profits to be made from arming the South, however, the narrator of Smith's novel notes that, quote, sympathy for the Confederacy in European upper-class circles was overt. So these 5 men, offended by the American unwillingness to share rights to the timber, furs, and other natural resources they've looted from native peoples, decide to teach the Americans a lesson by secretly supplying military hardware to the Plains tribes, which they will smuggle over the Canadian border. So Smith presents both imperialism and manifest destiny as geographic processes of capital accumulation, but processes that are always underscored by racism. Furthermore, he suggests that white Americans' deeply personal and national investment in imagining Indian identity as trapped in the past, technologically and socially primitive, never modern, leads them to both work frantically to keep guns out of the hands of Indians, even as they insist that Indians are too primitive to use them properly, even if they have them. So the character at the center of this initial smuggling operation will spend much of the first section of the novel crisscrossing North America to build ties between different tribes and convince them to join the Sioux and Cheyenne in opposing the U.S., is a man, quote, called John Setter by the whites and Where the Sun Goes by the chiefs. So Where the Sun Goes story is presented in terms of a connected European and American web of racial capitalism. He's a member of the Mandan people, a once powerful Plains tribe respected and envied by white traders for its control of trade along the Missouri River. Where the Sun Goes is a child when his nation is decimated by smallpox, spread to them through deliberately contaminated blankets. Also a real-world historical detail. Quote, out of 3,000, only 30 remained, Where the Sun Goes recalls. I was a boy then, and for some reason I lived and had no pox. A Jesuit priest finds the boy and takes him north to Montreal, where he teaches him to read and write, at which point, Where the Sun Goes explains, I became valuable to him. At once a scribe, a personal servant, and a commodity, Youngwood travels with the Jesuit around the world, traversing the lines of colonialism and capitalism, binding Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As an adult, Where the Sun Goes realizes his place within both cultures, able to speak several European languages, understanding European and American economic and colonial policies, while always being underestimated because of the color of his skin, supplies him with a powerful tool. And as the Native coalition comes together for war, and later as it works to build a new Indian nation, Where the Sun Goes' ability to translate between cultures and worlds mirrors the changes and accommodations the tribes go through after their military victory in order to form themselves into a modern nation capable of defending newly established borders while still maintaining indigenous identities. So Smith presents this process as neither romanticized nor easy. The Great Plains are foreign and terrifying to those Indians from eastern, southern, and northwestern tribes, places with trees, who leave the now bifurcated United States to become part of the newly forming Indian nation. Planting crops and building permanent towns is normal for the Cherokee, but foreign to the nomadic Plains tribes. A life without constant raiding is useless and enervating to the Apache. Traditional enemies are forced to make peace and live with each other side by side. Quote, camps larger than any ever seen before were springing up on the prairies, Smith writes. Cherokee log cabins sat beside Crow teepees. A visitor could, within 100 yards, pass by the wood and earth lodges of Hidatsa, the grass lodges of Wichita, and an Omaha camp of snugly bundled planks. More indicative of the sense of nationhood are the massive ceremonies involving thousands of Native participants and spectators held to forge a sense of citizenship among the formerly disparate tribes. So the restructuring of Native societies and the sometimes wrenching compromises such changes demand continue after the close of World War I, when a formal treaty is finally signed between the United States and the Indian nation, institutionalizing the boundaries established in the 1870s. Even at this time, Smith's narrator notes, to Americans, the new nation in their midst was a paradox. No Americans were yet convinced that the Indians would be able to govern themselves. The United States, Canada, France, and Germany, and later the Soviet Union, continually insist to the Indian nation and to each other that Indian nationalism can never be stable, Indian citizenship cannot possibly be anything but a farce, and the Indian nation cannot continue to exist without the guidance and protection of a white nation to govern and discipline what they imagine must be Indian anarchy and lawlessness. At the same time, what disturbs Americans most is not the differences of the Indian nation from them, but its similarities to them. Smith presents one source of this unease in the establishment of the Council of Chiefs that will govern the new Indian nation. So at the first conference of all the chiefs, a Lakota called Black Horse says, quote, "When you say," speaking to where the sun goes, "that we must make some sort of federation of nations like the Wasichu," he writes, "we wonder, do we have to be like them so much?" A Seneca woman responds by explaining that when the American colonies first met in the Convention of Albany to plot rebellion against Great Britain, there was disagreement over how they should organize themselves. Quote, "But the wisest man there," she explains, "was Benjamin Franklin, and he suggested that they use us, the League of the Longhouse, as their model. Much of what the Wasichu agreed to was only a copy of the League." This is also a bit of actual history. "So you see, we would not be copying them, only ourselves." So here we get to see the US Constitution presented as simulacra, a sort of second-rate copy of Franklin's copy of the Indian original, while the Indian nation's new federation structure, both original and a copy of a copy of a copy, approaches what Baudrillard terms the hyper-real. So Smith's presentation, though, of the militarization of the Indian nation brings up a lot of other questions about the connections between violence and nationalism, obviously questions that were extremely pertinent in 1969, and the defense of territory. Smith seems unable to imagine a genuine native sovereignty not based in territorial integrity defended at the end of a gun. Or put another way, perhaps what Smith is unable to imagine is an Indian nation allowed to exist without being subjected to constant military threats. This latter drives Smith's history of the Indian nation as it moves into the 20s. So by the late 1800s, Sitting Bull, instead of being assassinated at Standing Rock, as happens in our real world, is instead elected first chief of the nations, while Crazy Horse is elected to lead the war chiefs. Sitting Bull, in establishing the nation, orders that, quote, "railroads be built from the camp of the nations at the center of the Great Plains to every direction, curving only to save the grounds of the buffalo. The Europeans," he explains, "were not able to establish the circle of build, tax, loan that they had in China. Crazy Horse built something else. Every breakthrough in military technology was tested by his warriors. His dog soldiers were equipped with a Hotchkiss gun, a gas-driven machine gun. Krupp 9-inchers replaced the Civil War howitzers. When Crazy Horse became chief of the nation upon Sitting Bull's death, he left a military machine that became the first with a serious air force, modeled after the horse soldiers of the plains. The very first Indian industry," the narrator continues, "was the manufacturing of bullets and shells." The militarism of the Indian nation is presented in the novel as necessary for its survival, since to Americans, the Indians' continued traditions of communal living, automatic sharing with those in need, and lack of private property is by the early 20th century labeled communism. The Indian nation's refusal to embrace modern capitalism makes it an object of both lust and hatred. By the mid-1930s, when U.S. states to the east and west of the Indian nation are ravaged by drought and dust storms, quote, America looked to the Indian nation with bald envy. Even as Indian land is still fertile, the Indian nation's economy, lacking a banking system, as well as, quote, the concept of faraway peoples as markets and themselves as the providers of raw materials, is minuscule but stable. Or as Smith imagines Joseph Kennedy putting it, Indians are too damn dumb to suffer the consequences of modern capital investment. Such resentment sparks renewed efforts, particularly by Louisiana Governor Huey Long, to provoke a war with the Indian nation, partly to appropriate still fertile Indian lands, but also to provide employment for millions of unemployed American men. Now, in the novel, the United States, Canada, and various European nations, although not Mexico, which has itself seen a native revival and recognizes and supports the Indian nation. Other nations, the US, Canada, and European nations fabricate excuses for assaults, some actual, some threatened, on the Indian nation. And this practice of empire continues throughout the Cold War until the Indian nation ultimately conceives of a way to thwart the most overt military threats by performing a globalized act of tricksterism, returning the predatory gaze of colonialism back on the would-be colonizers. So when the Indian nation refuses to engage with either the Soviets or the Americans, the narrator explains, quote, each power glared at the